The paint was still dripping from the solar panels when the first security camera went dark. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, the entire Willowbrook Estates security system, protecting 847 homes and a multi-million-dollar community, was completely offline. And standing in her pristine white sneakers on a ladder, admiring her handiwork with a satisfied smirk, was Beverly Hutchinson, HOA board president and the woman who was about to learn the hardest lesson of her entitled life. But let's rewind 12 hours, to when this neighborhood war began with a single knock on the door. David Rodriguez had been living peacefully in Willowbrook Estates for 3 years. A 34-year-old electrical engineer and former military communications specialist, David was the kind of neighbor everyone wanted: quiet, helpful, and incredibly smart. His modest 2-story colonial sat on the corner of Maple Street, distinguished only by the sleek black solar panel array that powered not just his home, but through his ingenious engineering, the entire neighborhood's security infrastructure. You see, when David moved in, the HOA was struggling with massive electrical bills for their security system. Cameras, motion sensors, emergency lighting, electronic gates. It was costing the community nearly $3,000 monthly. David, being the problem solver he was, proposed a solution. He'd install a larger solar array on his roof and route the excess power to run the community's security grid, cutting everyone's HOA fees by $40 a month. The previous HOA board had welcomed this with open arms. David spent $45,000 of his own money on the upgraded system, and for 2 years, everything worked perfectly. The neighborhood was safer, greener, and everyone's wallets were happier. Everything was perfect until Beverly Hutchinson got elected. Beverly Hutchinson was 52 years old, recently divorced, and had moved to Willowbrook Estates with one mission: to make everyone else as miserable as she was. Standing at 5 feet 2 inches with perfectly styled blonde hair that hadn't moved since 1995 and a wardrobe consisting entirely of pastel cardigans and khaki pants, Beverly was the human embodiment of a HOA violation notice. She'd won her election as HOA president on a platform of restoring traditional neighborhood values, which was code for, "I'm going to make your life hell if your house doesn't look exactly like mine." In her first 3 months, she'd issued 127 violation notices for offenses ranging from lawn height exceeding regulation by 1/4 inch to holiday decorations displayed beyond acceptable timeframe. Someone had left a small American flag up for an extra week after July 4th. Beverly had a particular hatred for anything that made individual homes stand out. Solar panels, in her mind, were an abomination, unsightly black blemishes that ruined the aesthetic harmony she was desperately trying to achieve. But Beverly had a problem. David's solar installation had been approved by the previous board, and legally, she couldn't just demand their removal. The panels were grandfathered in under the old rules. So she did what every petty tyrant does when they can't get their way legally: she decided to get creative. It started with a knock on David's door on a Tuesday evening in September. David opened it to find Beverly standing on his porch, clipboard in hand, wearing a smile that could freeze lava. "Good evening, David," she said in that syrupy sweet voice that immediately put him on guard. "I hope you don't mind, but I was just doing my evening neighborhood inspection, and I couldn't help but notice your solar panels seem to be, well, rather dirty." David glanced up at his panels, which he'd cleaned just 2 weeks earlier. "They look fine to me, Beverly." "Oh, but they don't match the rest of the neighborhood aesthetic," she continued, making little tick marks on her clipboard. "The glare is quite bothersome, and several neighbors have complained about the unsightly appearance." "Which neighbors?" David asked, crossing his arms. Beverly's smile tightened. "Well, that's confidential, of course. But I'm here to help. I've been researching solutions, and I found that there are special coatings that can reduce the glare and make them blend better with traditional roofing materials. Much more neighborly, don't you think?" David stared at her for a long moment. He'd dealt with people like Beverly in the military, little dictators drunk on whatever tiny amount of power they could grab. "The panels are functioning perfectly and are completely legal," he said calmly. "Is there anything else?" Beverly's fake smile cracked just slightly. "Of course, they're legal now. But the HOA board will be reviewing all grandfathered installations at our next meeting. It would be such a shame if we had to pursue other options. The threat was clear, even wrapped in her passive-aggressive pleasantries. "Have a lovely evening, David," she chirped, clicking down his walkway in her sensible heels. That night, David did what any good engineer would do. He researched. He pulled out the original HOA documents, his installation permits, the electrical agreements, and every piece of correspondence from the past 3 years. Everything was airtight. Beverly couldn't touch his panels legally. But David had learned something important in the military. When dealing with irrational people, logic isn't always enough. You have to be prepared for illogical actions. So he installed something extra on his security system, a few discrete cameras pointed at his own roof. Meanwhile, Beverly was doing her own research. She'd spent hours on anti-solar Facebook groups and HOA forums, reading stories of people who'd found creative ways to deal with problematic neighbors. She'd learned about a particular type of paint, sold under the guise of anti-glare coating, that could permanently damage solar panels while looking like a helpful improvement. Beverly felt clever. She felt righteous. She felt like she was about to solve her biggest problem. What Beverly didn't feel was curious enough to ask why David's electric meter ran backwards sometimes, or wonder why the community's electrical bills had been so low lately. She certainly didn't bother to look at the electrical schematics filed with the city, which clearly showed the connection between David's solar array and the neighborhood's security infrastructure. Beverly Hutchinson was about to learn that ignorance isn't always bliss. 3 weeks later, on a moonless Thursday night at 2:47 a.m., Beverly struck. She'd been watching David's house for days, noting his schedule, waiting for the perfect moment. Dressed in all black, which, if you'd seen Beverly, was comically out of character, she crept across his lawn carrying a ladder, paint rollers, and 2 gallons of what the helpful man at the hardware store had assured her was premium solar panel anti-glare coating. The helpful man at the hardware store had lied. It was just regular exterior paint with a fancy label and a 300% markup. But Beverly didn't know that. What she also didn't know was that David's security cameras were already tracking her movement across the yard, recording everything in crystal clear night vision. David, awakened by motion alerts on his phone, lay in bed watching the surreal scene unfold on his security monitor. Part of him wanted to stop her immediately. Part of him was curious to see just how far she'd go. But the engineer in him was fascinated by what was about to happen when she disrupted the power flow to the security system. Beverly positioned her ladder against the house and began to climb. She'd brought a headlamp, which she somehow thought made her less visible. Criminal masterminds, Beverly was not. She reached the roof edge and began methodically painting over each solar panel with thick, white paint. "This'll show him," she muttered to herself, completely oblivious to the cameras recording her confession. Aesthetic harmony restored. Panel by panel, she painted over David's solar array. It took her almost 2 hours, but she was thorough. When she was finished, she stood back and admired her work. The panels were completely covered, looking like strange white rectangles on the roof. Beverly climbed down, gathered her supplies, and disappeared into the night, convinced she'd won. She had no idea she'd just declared war on the wrong person. David woke up at 6:30 a.m. to chaos. His phone was buzzing with notifications from neighbors reporting that their security cameras were down, the electronic gate at the main entrance was stuck open, and the emergency lighting throughout the community had failed. More importantly, his solar system monitoring app showed 0 power generation despite the bright morning sun. David stepped outside and looked up at his roof. Every single panel was painted white. His first emotion wasn't anger. It was actually impressed admiration for the sheer audacity of it. Beverly had actually climbed onto his roof in the middle of the night to vandalize his property. The woman was certifiably insane. His second emotion was strategic satisfaction. Because Beverly had just handed him everything he needed to destroy her. By 7 a.m., David's phone was ringing constantly. His neighbor Carol from across the street called first. "David, our security camera went out sometime last night. Do you know what's going on?" Then Frank from 2 houses down. "The motion sensors in the common area aren't working. My app says the whole system is offline." Then Linda, the elderly widow from the end of the street. "David, dear, the emergency lighting by the walking path is out. I'm scared to take my morning walk. Each call was another nail in Beverly's coffin, though she didn't know it yet. By 8 a.m., David had received 17 calls from concerned neighbors. The pattern was clear: the entire security system was down, and people were getting worried. David knew exactly why, but he decided to play dumb for a little while longer. By 9 a.m., word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. A community that had grown accustomed to feeling safe behind their electronic gates and comprehensive camera system was suddenly feeling vulnerable. The Facebook group Willowbrook Estates Community was blowing up with posts. Anyone else's security cameras down? Gate won't close at the main entrance. Emergency lighting is out on Elm Street. What's going on with our security system? David finally posted in the group, "Hi everyone. I think I know what's causing the security system failure. Could everyone meet at the community center at 11 a.m.? I'll explain what happened." Meanwhile, Beverly was having the best morning of her life. She'd woken up, made herself a cup of coffee, and taken a little walk past David's house to admire her handiwork. The solar panels were perfectly white, finally matching the aesthetic standards she'd been fighting for. She felt victorious. Righteous. Like she'd finally put that arrogant engineer in his place. Beverly was so pleased with herself that she decided to post in the community Facebook group, "Good morning, neighbors. Beautiful day, isn't it? I noticed some improvements being made to maintain our neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Sometimes it takes strong leadership to preserve the values that make our community special." If you've ever wondered what foreshadowing looks like in real life, that Facebook post was it. At 11 a.m. sharp, the Willowbrook Estates Community Center was packed. David estimated about 200 people had shown up, nearly a quarter of the neighborhood's residents. The crowd was anxious, confused, and looking for answers. Beverly arrived fashionably late, of course, sweeping in like she was attending a royal gala instead of an emergency community meeting. She dressed in her finest HOA president outfit, a powder blue cardigan, pressed khaki pants, and her signature pearl necklace. She took her seat in the front row with the other board members, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. David stood up at the front of the room and looked out at his neighbors. These were good people, families, retirees, young professionals, who trusted him to keep their community safe. And because of one person's petty vandalism, that safety had been compromised. "Thank you all for coming," David began. "I know you're concerned about the security system failure, and I want to explain exactly what happened." He pulled out his laptop and connected it to the room's projector. The first slide showed a detailed diagram of the neighborhood's electrical grid. 3 years ago, when I moved here, the HOA was spending $3,000 a month on electricity for our security infrastructure. That's $36,000 a year coming out of everyone's HOA fees. I proposed a solution. The next slide showed his solar installation plans. I invested $45,000 of my own money to install a solar array large enough to power not just my home, but the entire community security system. For the past 3 years, this system has saved the community over $100,000 in electrical costs while keeping us all safer. Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Several people nodded approvingly. Beverly shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Unfortunately," David continued, "sometime between 2:47 and 4:52 this morning, someone decided to vandalize my solar panels." The next slide showed a time-stamped photo of his painted-over panels. The room erupted in gasps and angry mutters. Beverly felt her cheeks burning, but she kept her expression neutral. "Now, painting over solar panels doesn't just make them ugly," David explained with the patience of someone teaching a physics class. "It completely destroys their ability to generate electricity. No solar power means no power to our security system. No security system means no cameras, no motion sensors, no electronic gates, and no emergency lighting." The crowd was getting angrier. Someone in the back shouted, "Who would do something like that?" David smiled grimly. "Well, let me show you." What happened next was like something out of a movie. David clicked to the next slide, and there on the big screen, in full color and crystal clear detail, Was Beverly Hutchinson climbing a ladder at 2:47 a.m. with paint and rollers. The room went dead silent for about 3 seconds. Then it exploded. Beverly! What the hell? Are you kidding me? Beverly shot up from her chair like she'd been electrocuted. Now wait just a minute. I can explain. But David wasn't done. He played the security footage like a nature documentary, narrating Beverly's middle-of-the-night crime spree in perfect detail. Here we see the subject approaching the residence at 2:47 a.m., carrying vandalism supplies. Note the all-black outfit, which is quite a departure from her usual pastels. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, but the anger was building. At 2:52 a.m., she begins positioning the ladder. You can see her looking around to make sure no one's watching. Unfortunately for her, everything is being recorded in HD. Beverly was frantically trying to interrupt. This is completely out of context. I was trying to help. Those panels were an eyesore. David paused the video on a perfect shot of Beverly painting over a panel, her face clearly visible in the headlamp light. At 3:23 a.m., she begins applying paint to the first solar panel. You can actually hear her on the audio saying, "This'll show him." Would you like me to play that part with sound? No! Beverly shrieked. You're taking this completely out of context. What context? Asked Carol from across the street. Makes vandalizing someone's property and destroying our security system acceptable? Beverly looked around the room desperately. Every face was staring at her with a mixture of shock, anger, and disgust. These people had trusted her to lead their community, and she'd sabotaged their safety over her personal aesthetic preferences. I was trying to improve the neighborhood appearance. Those panels were ruining our property values. Frank from 2 houses down stood up. Beverly, my wife has early-stage dementia. She gets confused and sometimes wanders at night. Those security cameras and motion sensors help us keep track of her. Because of what you did, if she'd wandered off last night, we might not have found her. The room was turning hostile fast. David realized he needed to regain control before things got ugly. I think, he said loudly, we need to discuss what happens next. Beverly made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. She straightened her cardigan, lifted her chin, and tried to project authority. As HOA president, I have the right to enforce community standards. Those solar panels were grandfathered in under the old board, but that doesn't mean they can't be regulated for aesthetic compliance. The room erupted again, but David held up his hand for silence. Beverly, let's talk about your rights as HOA president, he said calmly. First, you have no right to trespass on private property. Second, you have no right to vandalize anyone's belongings. Third, you definitely have no right to sabotage the community's safety infrastructure. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed legal analysis. What you did last night constitutes criminal trespassing, vandalism, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment of community welfare. The damage to my solar array alone is approximately $8,000 in repairs. Beverly's face went pale. But that's not the worst part, David continued. Because you destroyed the power source for our security system, you've left this entire community vulnerable. What if there had been a break-in last night? What if someone had a medical emergency in one of the areas covered by our cameras? What if a child had gotten lost in one of the sections where our emergency lighting was down? The room was dead silent now, the weight of Beverly's actions settling over everyone. Furthermore, David said, pulling out a thick folder, I've done some research into your tenure as HOA president. In the past 4 months, you've issued 127 violation notices, 89% of which were later overturned as frivolous. You've spent over $12,000 in community funds on legal fees pursuing violations that had no basis in our actual HOA covenants. Beverly tried to interrupt, but David kept going. You've also been charging the community for aesthetic improvement consultations from a company called Hutchinson Home Staging. Would you like to tell everyone who owns Hutchinson Home Staging? Beverly's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That's right, David said. Beverly has been using her position as HOA president to funnel community money into her own pocket through her staging business. That's embezzlement. The crowd was beyond angry now. People were standing up, shouting questions, demanding answers. Beverly looked like she was about to faint. But David still wasn't finished. "Now, Beverly," David said with the calm precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, "you're probably wondering how I'm going to handle this situation. You've committed multiple crimes, endangered our community, and stolen from our HOA funds. I could call the police right now and have you arrested." Beverly's eyes went wide with terror. "But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to give you a choice." He clicked to his final slide, which showed a resignation letter and a payment plan. Option 1, you resign from the HOA board immediately. You reimburse the community for all the money you've stolen through your fake consulting fees. That's $12,847.63. You pay for the complete repair and cleaning of my solar array. That's $8,000. And you make a public apology to the community for your actions. Beverly was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. Option 2, I call the police, press charges for trespassing, vandalism, destruction of property, and embezzlement, and let the legal system handle this. You'll face criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and probably jail time. The room waited in breathless silence. "You have 60 seconds to decide," David said, looking at his watch. Beverly looked around the room one more time, hoping to see even one sympathetic face. There weren't any. The people she'd tormented for months with petty violations and power trips were looking at her with the kind of contempt usually reserved for people who kick puppies. She whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again. "I choose option 1. The next hour was like watching a house of cards collapse. Beverly signed her resignation letter in front of 200 witnesses. She wrote a check for the stolen HOA funds from her personal account, apparently, being a petty tyrant pays well. She agreed to the payment plan for David's solar repairs. But the public apology was the real show. Standing at the front of the room, still in her powder blue cardigan but looking like she'd been hit by a truck, Beverly cleared her throat and began reading from the statement David had prepared. "I, Beverly Hutchinson, want to apologize to the Willowbrook Estates community for my actions. Last night, I trespassed onto David Rodriguez's property and vandalized his solar panels, which provide power for our neighborhood security system. My actions were selfish, illegal, and put our entire community at risk." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "I also want to apologize for abusing my position as HOA president to issue frivolous violations and to steal community funds through fake consulting fees. I have resigned from the board and will be making full restitution." The room was silent except for the sound of Beverly crying. "I let my personal prejudices override my responsibility to this community, and I'm deeply sorry. David Rodriguez has been nothing but a good neighbor who invested his own money to make all of our lives better, and I repaid his generosity with petty vandalism." She looked up from the paper and made eye contact with David for the first time since the meeting began. "I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry to everyone. I'll be moving out of Willowbrook Estates as soon as I can arrange it." With that, she gathered her purse and walked out of the community center, leaving behind a room full of neighbors who were still processing what they'd just witnessed. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. David arranged for emergency power to restore the security system while his solar panels were being cleaned and repaired. The cleaning crew he hired said they'd never seen anything quite like it. Someone had used nearly 2 gallons of paint to cover panels designed to absorb light. "It's like someone tried to blind the sun," the crew chief joked. While the repairs were happening, something beautiful occurred in the community. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before were suddenly working together. Carol from across the street organized a meal train for David. Frank set up a voluntary patrol schedule to help with security while the cameras were down. Linda started a neighborhood watch group that met every evening at the community center. Beverly's reign of petty tyranny had actually brought the community closer together. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after the great solar panel incident, David's system came back online. Every panel was sparkling clean, the power generation was back to normal, and the community's security infrastructure hummed back to life. David stood in his front yard, coffee mug in hand, watching his neighbors walk their dogs, kids riding bikes, And people actually talking to each other instead of hiding behind closed doors afraid of HOA violations. His phone buzzed with a text from Carol. Cameras back up. Everything working perfectly. Thank you for everything you did, David. You saved our neighborhood. 2 weeks later, the community held elections for a new HOA board. David didn't want the position. He was happy being the neighborhood's unofficial technology consultant, but they convinced him to serve as vice president with a focus on infrastructure and community safety. The new president was Carol, whose campaign platform was simple: let's be neighbors, not enforcement officers. The first act of the new board was to officially recognize David's solar installation as a community heritage asset and pass a resolution that any future HOA presidents who tried to mess with it would be immediately removed from office. They also established the Beverly Hutchinson Memorial Fund. She wasn't dead, but the name stuck, dedicated to community improvement projects. The fund was seeded with the money Beverly had been forced to repay. Beverly herself had indeed moved out of the neighborhood, reportedly to a senior living community in Arizona where, according to Linda, who knew someone, she was already complaining about the color of other residents' patio furniture. But here's the beautiful irony: Beverly's actions had actually made the community stronger, safer, and more connected than it had ever been. Her petty attempt to control everyone had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the opposite of what she wanted. Today, 3 years later, David's solar array powers not just the security system, but also the community center, the swimming pool pumps, and the electric vehicle charging stations the new board installed in the parking areas. The neighborhood's carbon footprint has dropped by 60%, property values have increased by 15%, and the community has been featured in 3 different magazines as a model of sustainable suburban living. Beverly? Well, according to Linda's intelligence network, she was recently asked to leave her Arizona senior community after she painted over someone's hummingbird feeder because it didn't match the desert aesthetic. Some people never learn. But David learned something valuable. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully isn't to fight them directly. Sometimes you just have to let them defeat themselves while you keep building something beautiful. And every morning, when he sees those gleaming black solar panels catching the first rays of sunrise, he smiles. Not because he won, but because his community won. Because 847 families wake up every day a little safer, a little greener, and a little more connected to each other. That's real power. That's real victory. And that's a lesson Beverly Hutchinson will never understand, no matter how many solar panels she paints.